Okay, good morning, everyone. Or, well, it's morning here. I don't know what it is there. Hello. Uh, Welcome back. And let's start by setting a positive motivation and spending some time calming our minds in calm abiding. Okay, so let's start off with a little bit of review from yesterday. Yesterday we went over the spread of Buddhism from India to other countries within Asia, Southeast Asia. And one of the things we talked about is that the teachings that were written down in two phases. The earlier phase, or the first language in which they were written down, is the Pali language. And the Pali language is actually the Buddhists spoke, the actual language that the Buddhists spoke was a dialect of Pali. And the Pali Canon, it's called, so the Pali texts are still in existence, and they still continue to be an inspiration and guidance for many types of Buddhism in the world, in particular those like the Thai forest tradition in Thailand, Burmese tradition in Myanmar, Burma, in Laos, Cambodia, these kinds, Sri Lanka, very popular. And these are also known as the Theravada schools, which was one of the original 18 schools that was part of this Pali tradition. And then the other language in which they were written down is Sanskrit. And the Sanskrit tradition is actually the tradition that Tibet inherited. It also went to China, Japan, Mongolia, Burma, Bhutan, and Nepal, these areas north of the Ganges River Valley. And so there were monastic universities that rose in India at the time, northern India, and one that was very huge and also had many great scholars that we still study today, was the Nalanda Monastic University. And so His Holiness the Dalai Lama often calls this tradition that we're studying, this Tibetan tradition, the Nalanda tradition, because many of the scholars came from there and came to Tibet and taught Buddhism in Tibet. So from that, then the Tibetans preserved the teachings and practiced the teachings for 1,000 years, and they had a significant portion, something like, I can't even quote accurately, but a big portion of their population was actually in monasteries and practicing and meditating and debating, and the rest of the people in the country were supporting these monasteries so the whole focus of the country was on spiritual development. So you can see that it was kind of an amazing place, all these beings that were developing their minds and their spirituality, and yeah, kind of amazing. And then so then when it was invaded in 1959 by the Chinese, and the Chinese attempted to destroy much of Tibetan Buddhism, they destroyed a lot of the monasteries. They killed over 1 million people, and something like 800,000, I think, escaped. And in that first, in the late 1950s, in that first, what they called diaspora. And many of them were high lamas. And these lamas were, India very kindly supported them, brought them to India, gave them jobs, and allowed, His Holiness to set up the Tibetan government in exile here in Dharamsala area. And so His Holiness immediately, what was really important to him was that the Buddhist teachings continue. So that's why we have access to these teachings today. And we're very, very fortunate because of His Holiness supporting all the lamas to teach. So one of the things that we also inherited were the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa. So the statue behind me, and he's considered the founder of the Gelug school. And he wrote a book that we're particularly studying, which is called the Lamrim Chenmo, which is great stages on the path to enlightenment. And in it, he divided the teachings into three capacities, beings of three capacities. And so let's look at that slide. So those beings of small capacity are looking for a better future life. Not, but so all of the beings on the path and anyone who considers themselves Buddhist is not simply looking for this life only. So what happens with Buddhism, so it isn't like some religions where you suffer now for a better future life, like that your life now you just accept how horrible it is and you just deal with it, and then in the future when you after you die then you get your reward in heaven, something like this. Some religions are emphasize that. Within Buddhism, we do think about future lives, but we also know that by thinking about and developing ourselves and thinking about future lives and starting to do some of these meditations and develop these realizations, that we're improving this life as well. But it's not our primary concern. It's not our main focus. We're actually going beyond that. In addition to this life, we do start to enjoy the benefits of meditation and developing realizations now, but we're also creating the conditions for after we pass away. So the goal for those in small capacity is a better future life, and the main a way in which they start to do that is by seeing that if I only focus on this life, then I won't be able to create the conditions for a future life. And that's where renunciation comes in. Now, the medium, those beings of medium capacity talk about liberation from samsara. So it's not just a higher rebirth in a higher realm, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but it's freedom from the whole cycle of so samsara in this view. It's not this view of ordinary beings that is filled with ignorance is is problematic because when we are filled with this ignorance that sees self and others as concrete, separate, that sees external reality as somehow out there, creates the conditions for us to continue to suffer, to continue to create a situation in which we suffer. So developing this view of emptiness, of seeing things how they actually exist, how the mind participates in the reality, then we can achieve freedom from samsara, where we aren't under the control of these afflictive emotions, and we aren't simply stuck in this up and down cycle. So Mingyur Rinpoche, one of my teachers, is very fond of talking about how life is like the stock market, that it goes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down, and it's guaranteed that when you go up, you're going to go down, and when you go down, you're going to go up. And so right now, we're seeing this impermanence, this change in such a big way. Kajala just sent out a prayer, and she talked about how heaven and earth have been switched, and it's so clear, this impermanence in our lives, that this change, that this huge change, within the course of a couple of weeks now, or at least in India, we can't go out of our houses except during certain hours and only for certain things. And the rest of the time, we're very, locked down, and there's no air travel, and very good for the air. And, no taxis, and it's very quiet. And I mean, just in a very short time, because of this, the spread of this disease. And so it's a very good lesson in how things can change so quickly, and we tend to rely on things staying the same, most of the time, that you're going to get up and the sun is going to rise again today, and that summer is going to change into fall, which is going to change into winter. And here we have this very global, very quick, spread of this disease that has changed everyone's life in such dramatic ways. So it's a huge lesson for us on impermanence, on how change can happen out of our control, and we are, we're subject to it without us being to control it. Yeah. And that our circumstances that we tend to rely on, that we work so hard for, can just, fizzle away. But at the same time, this up and down thing, like eventually the lockdown is going to be lifted, and we're going to have freedom again to travel and to go out when we want to, and all these kinds of things. But it'll be changed, won't it? It won't be the same. And in some ways, that freedom, to leave our houses and to travel and that sort of thing, will be more precious, because we lost it, because we recognized that it could be taken away at any time. And so we start to see, when we experience this gross impermanence, this obvious impermanence, that what we have now, we become so much more grateful for and so much more happy with. Okay, so back to medium capacity. So liberation from samsara, is the focus in this one is on ourselves alone, in particular, our becoming free from samsara. So then when we start talking about the great capacity, we're talking about going further, okay, beyond liberation into enlightenment, and for the benefit of beings, not simply for myself alone. And we see that liberation is very nice to, and it is, people and beings who are liberated have huge compassion and huge love, but they don't have this, what they consider the capacity to go the distance, to take on the responsibility of freeing all beings. They don't necessarily have that. And so then they don't put in the extra effort, and not because they don't want to, not because they don't want to free sentient beings. It's just this idea that it's too much, it's beyond me, and I don't have that capacity. And so then the main focus for the beings of great capacity is bodhicitta. Okay, so when we're talking about the small scope, we talk about the four thoughts that turn the mind. So precious human life, we're going to talk about today, death and impermanence. So death and impermanence, like I was just saying, that death brings the end of our current circumstances. And right now we have very, very perfect circumstances to be able to develop ourselves spiritually. And we want to make the most of these circumstances. But if we recognize that death is uncertain, could come at any time, and that impermanence exists, that change is constantly happening, and even big change, then our circumstances that we have right now are very tenuous. They may not last. And so then we start to turn the mind toward this dharma, toward developing these realizations, toward developing the conditions so that we can continue to practice, continue to develop our minds, and eventually be liberated from samsara. So the suffering of existence is another thing that turns the mind. And that we did a great meditation yesterday with Felipe on renunciation, starting to see how those things like job and food and relationships and they things that they don't bring lasting happiness, that they eventually they go away. And it's suffering when we lose these things that we expect to continue to make us happy. So so that also turns us. And then if we even have this understanding that we could stop being subject to aging and death and sickness, that there's a point in which we could actually go beyond that, that too would be amazing. So just meditating on how awful it is to be subject to death, to be subject to suffering, it's no fun. And if there's actually the hope, if there's actually the the possibility that we could not re-experience this again, it would be amazing. And then karma talks about this, that we want to develop virtues, that we want to avoid non-virtues, so that we can continue to create the situation for ourselves in which we have the resources, we have the freedom from suffering that we want to have in order to continue to develop. So turning the mind away from non-virtue and putting effort into things like, not lying and not stealing and, respecting others in those ways. Okay. So let's talk about the different realms of existence. But before we go to that, I'll bring that slide back, so don't worry about writing it down right away. Okay. So when we talk about realms of existence, we're talking about what happens after death. It's also a little bit about this life, but for most of us, and this was true for me, when I first started learning about realms, it was really hard for me to imagine being anything other than a human being. Because that's what I am, right? And this is my experience. And I see animals around me, so I know that animals exist, but somehow I couldn't connect that somehow there was the possibility that I could have been born an animal instead of a human. um, and and yet when we start to evaluate, we start to look, and of course if you studied Western biology, or even health, I think I learned it in 7th grade health, where babies come from, um, it doesn't really say the why, does it? It explains the how human beings are created and come into existence, how I got this human body, how I got this human life, but it doesn't really explain why. Why me? Why did this consciousness, this me, I mean, we have to, of course, talk about that. What does that self mean? But why did that me become, a human being instead of a cow? And so when we don't really have an answer to that, we can imagine actually that I could have been born a cow. I mean, it is a possibility that this consciousness could have, especially when we start to consider that this consciousness did not come from a did not come from the body, that the consciousness existed before the body existed. And so then why was this consciousness, manifested as this body? And why wouldn't it manifest as, as in an animal body? And so we can actually start to break up that sort of, centrist kind of attitude that sees only my experience as the only possibility and the only actuality. And we do this, of course, through meditation. One of the best meditations that we can do on renunciation and future lives is imagine if we were a cow. And what would our lives be like, if we were tied up all day in someone's yard, if we were only, we had no control over food, we couldn't go out and graze. Now, some cows in India, they're allowed to graze and run around, and find food for themselves, but still they don't always find the food, right? And, the difference between being able to control our lives, even in some way, like I can go down to the grocery store limited times, but I can wait in line and get vegetables still, in my life. But for a cow, they wouldn't even know where to go, I mean, sometimes, yeah, they just don't have that kind of reasoning capacity, which isn't to say that they're lesser creatures. They have just as much, they have Buddha potential too, but they just don't have the opportunities and the freedoms that we do as human beings. They can't even imagine different circumstances for themselves and then act on that imagination of envisioning how their lives could be different, which human beings have this ability to do. So So this powerful meditation, imagining ourselves as a cow and seeing that we wouldn't want to be that. We would not want that kind of a life. So then, so then the Buddha talked about different realms of existence in his teachings. He didn't try to prove their existence. And the reason why was because the audience that he was teaching to already agreed that it was true. Okay, he wasn't teaching to an audience that had been educated within the, this Western scientific kind of model that sees, that sees materialism, that only what we can see or hear and taste and touch is what is real. He was teaching to an audience that already accepted that we are stuck in this cycle of samsara, of being born in different realms and over and over and over again. So he didn't try to prove it. But he did talk about it. He did talk about, if you don't want to be born in, in the future as an animal or as these other things, then this is how, the best way to act and the best way to practice. So for us who can't see other realms, we don't have the, the power, the capacity to see a God realm or a ghost realm or a hell realm. We have to, in some ways, trust that they actually exist. So we come back to relying on an authority and looking at the, is the Buddha a reliable teacher? So we can examine the Buddha's authority. We can examine the Buddha's, are some of the other things that we can validate that the Buddha taught also true? And if they are true, if he wasn't lying all over the place and trying to deceive us, then why wouldn't this aspect of his teachings always be true, also be true? So we can examine that. Is the Buddha an accurate authority in the teachings? And if the Buddha is, then why wouldn't we agree with his teachings on the different realms? So the other way in which sometimes these realms are taught is from a psychological perspective, that even though human beings have a human body, sometimes their minds are so filled with these different delusions that it's as if they are living in a certain realm. So if you're not ready to take on this, existence of other realms, then in their actuality in some way, then we can see that that we could be as if we were like living in a hell, if we had this, if our minds were filled and overpowered by these different delusions. So let's look at the delusions that are related to these realms. So the different realms of existence, we have 6 realms. We have hell being realms. So this is considered the most suffering. And it is because it is filled with hatred. So someone who is existing in a hell realm has a mind that was very angry, and wanted to hurt people and harm people. And as a result, then they have the experience of others harming them, of others hating them. And then we talk about a hungry ghost realm. So a hungry ghost realm is more about greed and miserliness. So never sharing anything, and also never being satisfied as a result, always wanting and wanting and wanting, and never having any kind of contentment or any gratitude. And I'm sure you have probably heard of people like this, that no matter how much they have, they're never happy. And that would be a kind of, a lower realm, okay? Not necessarily a pleasant state of mind to be in. And then animals we talked about already, just filled with this ignorance, this inability to imagine how to change their circumstances. I was listening to an interesting teaching about how, they have taught
chimpanzees and gorillas how to use language. But one thing that they found is, and this has never happened in all the research and all this process of teaching them language, these animals have never asked a question. They have never, turned around and said, something like, why is this way, or how to do this way. It's it's very much this, repetition and modeling, and, you know, imitation, rather than actual, coming up with something new. I mean, it was a big deal when Jane Goodall found that chimpanzees were using tools, that they were using a stick to get food. That was a big thing, that they had that skill, but they're still really limited. I mean, I look at the monkeys around here, and they are so subject to their conditioning, to their instincts, to their environment. They just, yeah, compared to us humans who can imagine possibilities, anticipate danger, change, even to come in out of the rain, they're, yeah, very, very sad. So this idea that they don't have this abstract thinking, that they're very limited, in very ignorant. And then I'm going to skip over humans for now. I'll come back to them. So the demigod realm is, and the God realm and the human realm are considered the upper realms, because there is more freedom from suffering. So the God realm is not the same as a Christian God. Okay, it's not all powerful, and it's not creator in any way. Okay, it is. It's one of the realms, so they're still stuck in samsara, which means that when their lives come to an end, even though they have really, really long lives, once their lives come to an end, they are subject to the other realms, so to being born in a hell or as a hungry ghost. And they have like no difficulties whatsoever in their lives. They have, everything is totally comfortable, and everything they want they have, and everything is peaceful, and there's no no challenges in their lives, so they don't ever even think about spirituality, because everything is perfect. And as a result, they think they're better than everybody else, because they have everything that they ever wanted. And we can see this also in the human realm, that there are some people who have never had any, they've been born into these excellent circumstances. Things come very easy to them. And then they think that they aren't subject to the rest of the world, or to the conditions that happen, when in fact they are subject to aging and death as well, and sickness. And then the demigod realm has quite a bit of these same pleasures, but they also are filled with this jealousy of the God realm, because they don't have absolutely everything that the God realm has. Okay, so in both of these, they are so filled with jealousy and with pride that there's no room for spiritual practice. So within the human realm, it's considered the best realm of existence, because there is both equal suffering and equal freedom from suffering, to be able to progress on a spiritual path. So if you were never motivated, if you thought that things were so good that you didn't, why should you change anything? You're doing fine, things are going well. Then you would never be motivated to develop realizations, to practice, to, start to look for a different way of thinking about the world, because everything would be fine. Or if you had so much suffering that you were just overwhelmed by it, you would never have any time, you would never have any energy to be able to practice and examine and look and change and grow. Okay, so these are the realms of existence. Now, underlying this, of course, is this idea of reincarnation. So again, the Buddha didn't teach reincarnation to his followers, because it was already accepted. And of course, he agreed with it, because that was also, from his point of view, it was true. One of the things that they say that he learned on the night that he became enlightened, that he was able to see. He was able to see all of his past lives and all the lives that he had ever lived. And then he was able to see all the lives of all the sentient beings and all their, what had moved them from one life to another. So all their karmic conditions and all their delusions, that, and how they create suffering for themselves. So he, of course, agreed with this concept of reincarnation, and so did all of his audiences. And it wasn't actually until these, the Buddhists, the Indian scholars got together in these monastic universities, that we started to have these, great minds starting to apply logic to the proofs for reincarnation and the existence of past and future lives. And so there's one particular text called the Pramanavartika, which was written by Dharmakirti, who was an amazing logician in an Indian scholar. And he wrote a whole chapter that is very complex about some of the proofs for reincarnation. And then we have actually nowadays, we've had some scientists who have started to bring to light some of their own research into this concept of the possibility of reincarnation, because and reincarnation, this concept of reincarnation, they called it in the Catholic tradition, it used to exist. They called it the transmigration of the soul. And I've also been told that there are sects even in Israel, or in the area of Israel, who also believe in reincarnation. So, and I think it was in the Kabbalah, but don't quote me on that. So it has existed as a concept in many cultures, but it's only recently that in modern times, when we've started to accept this scientific materialistic point of view, that we start to see that this view that maybe life ends with death, that when we die we go out of existence. That's actually, for the world, is kind of a new concept. But for those of us educated in the West, this may not be true for many of you who are educated in India. Realms of existence and past and future lives are an accepted part of your culture, but for many of us who were not raised that way, and then I'm sure there's conflict, if you're taught in science that that the brain is the source of the mind, and then when the brain dies, the mind dies. Then looking at reincarnation, you have to be like, okay, do I have to choose one or the other? Do I have to go with science, or do I have to go with my beliefs of my culture? So it's an interesting combination. So let's look at some of the evidence around reincarnation. Okay, so we can look at it from the point of view of case studies. We can look at it from the point of view of reasoning from cause and effect. We can look at it from the point of view of near-death experiences. We can look at it from the point of view of whether it's neither nature nor nurture when people have certain characteristics. And we can look at this phenomena of tukdom. So I'm going to explain each one of these. So from case studies, so there was a scientist, American scientist in Virginia, who was, I think it's Virginia, pretty sure, yeah, University of Virginia, who was studying this phenomena of children who between the ages of about 3 and 6, so if you can imagine what a 3-year-old, if you've ever met a 3-year-old, looks like, to 6 years old, and how they act, what are their language skills like, how do they, they're really focused on play. They don't have a very big understanding of the rest of the world. And a lot of what they say is kind of, fun and funny and a little bit off the wall in some ways. And so, not, we don't necessarily pay attention to what they say. Um, but what they found, actually, what there's a phenomena that has existed that this researcher decided to investigate, is that there are a certain number of children who report memories of previous lives when they were growing, when they lived in the past, who their parents were, or like one little girl, when her mom was giving her a bath, and she said, when you were a little girl, I gave you a bath. So this idea that she was actually her mother's mother reincarnated. Okay, so these are the kind of statements. And then there's another one that was reported in a book. So there's Ian Stevenson's books are a little hard to read because they're all these case studies. So he decided to investigate them as scientifically as possible. So he did many interviews. He would hear about a child who had made these statements or was making these statements, and then he would send his team, or he would go and he would interview all the people who had heard these statements and try to check out whether these statements were actually had some factual basis, and is there a way in which the child could have learned that information that was not or if they could have known that information without having actually heard it from somewhere or learned it. So it was this investigation. So the name of the book is Life Before Life, and the author is Jim Tucker. And it's a very good book about that summarizes Ian Stevenson's research and also evaluates some of the explanations for these statements that these children made. So one fairly famous situation, that they investigated was a child who was riding in a train in India and with her father, and she started saying that she lived in that village that they were passing, and it happened to be about 50 kilometers, I think, from where she was actually born and lived with her current family. And what they did and what her parents' names were, and all this information about her previous life. So then they went and investigated, and they found out that actually there was a family that had lost a child at a young age, and those were their names of their parents, and those, they did sell incense, and so they were able to actually validate that this child knew facts that were not possible unless she had actually lived in that previous life. So, and he's collected, and this research is still going on. Last I heard, it was over 2,500 cases that they had investigated. And so in Jim Tucker's book, he examines what are some of the other possible explanations. Were these children making these things up? Was it just fantasy? Is that a possible explanation? Were the families somehow trying to get notoriety? Like, were they trying to be famous by reporting these things, making it up? Is that possible? So it's very good about, and there's no reason to think that somehow we would be different from these other children, that they lived in the past. So why do we think that somehow we would not have lived just because we can't remember? So that's often, people who argue against this idea of reincarnation. Well, oh, if I had lived before, then I should be able to remember my past lives. But we can barely remember, when we were little kids. We can't even remember last week what we had for breakfast. I mean, our memories are just not that good. And then what they found was that as these children get older, like around 7 or so, their current situation starts to outweigh, and they actually start to forget those memories that they had somehow carried with them into a future life. So this is something to look at. Would this phenomena exist if there wasn't past life? Okay. So the second one, the reasoning from cause and effect, has to do with, we've been talking before about this like produces like. So, and we talked about this in terms of the brain and the mind. So one of the arguments against reincarnation is this idea of an emergent property, of that the mind is an emergent property of the brain, that somehow the mind is produced by the brain. And so then, of course, when the brain dies, the mind dies. And we've been talking about reincarnation, about rebirth, being based on the fact that the mind existed before this current body exists, and that once this current body goes away, dies, that the mind continues to exist. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that the mind is each moment of mind is a cause for a future moment of mind. And we did the meditation on the continuum of the mind, and we started to look at how some aspects of our mind we can actually trace back to previous experiences that we have had. So this is a very good example, is when we're learning maths. So when we're first introduced to numbers, we see numbers in a very specific way, don't we? I mean, they're very concrete. They're like, our fingers, on our hands. We count with our fingers. And so when we learn that, this many fingers is represented by this particular symbol, okay? And that's, our first introduction to numbers. And then as we get educated, as our mind builds experiences, we start to see that numbers can be divided, that they can be added, that they can be turned into fractions, that they can be turned into equations that can represent reality, on and on, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. And so then a mind that has been trained in the experience of calculus sees numbers very differently than a mind that was, a 5-year-old mind that is first learning to count and first learning about numbers. But they're still related, aren't they? One couldn't have an understanding of calculus without first having had an understanding of concrete numbers. So we see that these previous moments of mind are connected to later moments of mind. So we can track back and back and back and until the moment of conception, when the first moment of mind appeared. Then what was the cause of that moment of mind? If it wasn't the body, if it wasn't the physical, then it had to have been a previous moment of mind that existed in a past life. And then we can talk about, okay, so this past life, the last moment of the past life becomes the cause for the first moment of the mind in this life, which becomes the cause for all the other moments up until the last moment of death. That last moment of mind becomes the cause for the next moment of mind in what we call an intermediate state or a future life. So beyond this life. So Dharmakirti talked about this. In particular, he talked about the fact that that like causes like, that you can't have the brain causing the mind, because the brain is physical and the mind is non-physical. So you need a non-physical cause, a previous moment of mind, in order to have a current moment of mind. So that's the reasoning from cause and effect. And then we can talk about the near-death experiences. Oh, I haven't even gotten to precious human life. I talk so much. Okay. So near-death experiences, there are people who have had experiences, usually in very traumatic situations in which they have had the experience, especially with our current technology, that has the ability to revive bodies that have not quite, their consciousness has not left the body completely. And so the bodies, people are quote unquote brought back to life with defibrillators, sometimes medicines, usually a combination of the two, bring people back to life. And they report having experiences that they were not possible, would not be possible if the brain was the source of the mind. Because in many of these circumstances, you have the situation in which oxygen was cut off from the brain and the brain was no longer functioning, and yet these people were having mental experiences. And there's a really good book about this, about a neurosurgeon who was actually convinced about this view that the mind does come from the brain. And then he got very, very sick with a type of meningitis, and he was in a coma for about a week. And during that time, they were, of course, doing tests and trying to figure out how to revive him, and evaluating his mental capacity. And what they found was that, from his point of view, so he came out of the coma, and he reported that he had actually many mental experiences that would not have been possible based on the tests that were done that showed that his brain was not functioning in a way that could produce those mental experiences. So he came out of that experience very much convinced that the mind could exist without the body, that that was actually possible. So the name of the author is Eben Alexander, Eben, and Alexander the Third. And he has videos on YouTube. He actually, I saw him speak with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. They had a dialogue about rebirth. It was very interesting. And the name of the book is Proof of Heaven. Okay, so these near-death experiences. Then we can look at this this idea of genetics. So many times when we talk about why gifted children in particular have these amazing abilities, like we can talk about Mozart, who was able to write symphonies at a very, very early age. And we say, well, the explanation often is that he had, the genetics, as well as he had the environment to be able to develop this this skill very quickly. But it's very hard to explain that with that, because you have people who are very similar, let's say siblings, who have very similar environments, very similar genetics, and even the how their genes develop, epigenesis, how their genes actually express themselves, very similar, and yet you have very different personality characteristics and very different aptitudes for certain things, especially in gifted children. And so it's very hard to say that that can be explained on a physical level through genetics and through how they were raised. So this is something that we have to, of course, we need more research. And unfortunately, this idea that somehow the mind has an existence that is not produced by the physical is still pretty, it spells death for many scientists, career death for many scientists. And it's very hard to get grants, right, and money to research these things. So you won't necessarily see the the research there, where they're actually saying, oh, this is the mind and not the body, or you know, or the environment. There's another amazing study done, and then I have to go to questions, about, so there are these Catholic nuns that are studied, and they agreed, that they would be willing to, once they passed away, that they would donate their brains to science. So what they did with these nuns, and nuns, actually Catholic nuns are a nice population, because their their environments are pretty controlled. They interact with the same people. They eat very similar foods. They don't have a huge amount of complexity to their lives. They have very simple lives. And so they all of these nuns were also committed to benefiting others. It was part of their order that they served others. So they were very active socially in terms of being teachers or nurses and this sort of thing. And so one of the things that they found, so they would do these cognitive tests. They would test their memory and their thinking ability. And then when they passed away, they would dissect their brains. And one of the things that they found is that for some of these nuns, after they dissected their brains, they found that they had all the physical characteristics of having advanced stage Alzheimer's, which is like a type of dementia where your cognitive function is very impaired. You can't really think clearly. You can't remember in general, even short-term memory. So you can't do logic very easily. And they found that actually, even though they had the physical components, their cognitive tests had shown that their thinking ability was fine. They were not subject to the physical conditions of their brain necessarily. That it's more of an example of where the mind had an ability to go beyond the physical circumstances. But of course, they don't explain it that way. I looked up the study, and they don't explain it that way. I don't know how they explain it, but this is definitely some of the findings that they found, which is very interesting, this idea of mind over matter. Okay, and then the last one I want to talk about is this, I'll remind you what they were so you can see. This phenomena of tukdom. So tukdom happens with some of these Tibetan lamas, and I'm sure it happens within other meditators in the Hindu religion. I'm just not as familiar with it as I am within the Tibetan tradition. So what happens is that these lamas will pass away, will die in meditation. So they get ready for their death. Like the story that I heard was, this happened not that long ago, about maybe 8 or 10 years ago. So maybe even more recently, actually, more like 5 or 6 years ago. There was one Lama who was, of course, raised in Tibet, educated in Tibet, practiced his whole life. He moved to the United States. His name was Geshe Sopa. He wrote the books that I was talking about yesterday, Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. And he stopped eating. He was in his 80s. At one point, he stopped eating. Then he stopped talking. And then he was mostly undisturbed and sitting up in his bed meditating for most of the end of his life. And of course, he had attendants, people coming in, taking care of him. And at one point, they recognized that he had stopped breathing. Okay, so his breathing had stopped and his heart rate had stopped. And when that happens for most of us ordinary beings, when we die, when our breathing stops and our heart rate stops, our body decomposes very quickly. Okay, it starts to, put off these gases and stink really bad. And, that's why we're buried or cremated like within 3 days. But what happens with these amazing meditators who pass away in this way is that actually their body continues to be preserved, even though their brains are no longer functioning. Okay, so what they say is that the consciousness is still present in the body, but it shows that it isn't a product of the brain. It's actually consciousness that is still present in the body. And when the consciousness leaves, there are actually signs of this, that then the body starts to decay. So I think, I don't know how many days Geshe Sopa stayed in this, what they call tukdam. So that's this state of being in meditation, where they're actually meditating on using this very powerful mind that becomes present at the time of death. And it can last up to a week or 2 weeks, 20 days, you know, for some meditators. And during that whole time, the body smells very sweet. It's very peaceful in the room. And they're still, you know, they're sort of in this place between what we call life and death. They've actually slowed down the process of their death, and they're using that meditation at the time of death. So this is another one about talking about some of the proofs. And there's actually at the University of Wisconsin, where Geshe Sopa taught for many years, there are some investigators who've done research, and as often as they can, they bring in their electrodes, you know, to see if there's any brain activity that is still happening when these lamas are in this state. And His Holiness really supports this research, but we haven't really seen the outcomes of it yet. So they're still gathering data on this phenomena. Pretty amazing. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about today. I'm sorry I didn't get to Precious Human Rebirth. We'll have to do it tomorrow. So if you have any questions, we can do that now.
Okay, I'll start by unmuting Russell Portier. You can now ask your question.
Hello, Venerable, and thank you for these teachings. My question is, as a bodhisattva upon rebirth, does one choose the time and place of rebirth? And after rebirth, must the bodhisattva continue with Buddhism again to find the path?
So yes, they say that in particular Arya bodhisattvas, so bodhisattvas who have achieved liberation, that they are able to choose where they are going to be reborn. And Robert Thurman, who is a very fun Buddhist scholar at Columbia University, he talks about bodhisattvas as being Arya bodhisattvas as being like psychonauts. So we have astronauts who make, you know, who shoot to the moon like moonshots, and we have bodhisattvas who make womb shots. So they shoot themselves to the certain womb where they want to be reborn. And then the answer to your other question is not necessarily. A bodhisattva who is choosing to be reborn is choosing where it's going to be of most benefit to the most sentient beings. So if another religious system, you know, manifesting in another religious system is of more benefit to sentient beings, then that's where they're going to go. And if no religious system, then they, you know, because we don't know, you know, Nelson Mandela or, you know, any secular leader who was not necessarily in a religious system. I don't know about Nelson Mandela's religious system. But, you know, anywhere where sentient beings need benefit, that's where a bodhisattva goes. And yeah, that's all.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, now I'm unmuting Akansha. You can now ask your question.
I have to stop.
Oh, wait. There.
Morning.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, I'm here again with a question.
That's okay.
This has actually been on my mind for a long time, at least for like 6 months. I am just not able to get myself to believe in the concept of reincarnation. And what you had stated earlier in terms of us taking the Buddha's authority, while I do that, Buddhism also emphasizes reasoning and questioning a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And given that us as normal beings don't really have any evidence of reincarnation or afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
Until we get to that point, it's not going to be easy to accept that idea. And my question is it going to then hinder the ability to walk on the path or to make advances? Um,
Not necessarily. I think that many of us are not, we exist somewhere on a continuum when it comes to rebirth, in the sense that some of us are closer to not believing, and some of us are closer to being more convinced. But rarely are there people who are so closed, say there's no way, absolutely not, nor are there people who are totally convinced that it's, yes, definitely it's going to be this way. So we all exist along this continuum. And according to Buddhism, being open is also part of it. Using logic and using reasoning is important, but also being willing to consider the possibility. So I think that it won't be an hindrance unless you totally say it's not possible, it's not going to happen, I'm not even going there. Then I think it would be more of a hindrance. But if you're still open to looking at some of the possibilities and some of the evidence in terms of the reasoning, then I think that then you're just being, you're actually being a good Buddhist because you're investigating.
So personally, I think I'm on one extreme because I have been trained as a scientist, so it's very hard for me to accept something without evidence.
Uh-huh.
And I am stuck there for some
Yeah.
time.
So those the reasonings that I just presented, have you researched those very much with your reasoning?
No, not yet.
Okay, so that's what I would recommend that you do, is look at some of these ones that I've presented. How do you explain away some of these possibilities? And also evidence. When we talk about evidence, are you talking only about what you can know with your senses, or are you also including what you can know with your reasoning?
Reasoning as well.
Yeah, okay. So that's more where I think you're going to find the proofs related to reincarnation are not necessarily evidence-based in in the senses, but also in the reasonings. Is it possible that these things exist, that this exists in this world? And I would really recommend, if you could get teachings on this Pramanavartaka, it challenges a lot of the non-Buddhist views that somehow there is no such thing as rebirth. And that's the more you can investigate that. And I know that Geshe Dorje Damdul at Tibet House has taught this, and maybe there's some recordings and some of his teachings. Okay. Sure.
Okay, next up we have, well, there's a question that somebody wants me to read for them.
Sure.
Can a meditation be created to get rid of any suffering or change a condition, maybe from past lives?
No, not if you've created a negative condition and a negative cause, and you're experiencing the result right now, then that seed has already ripened. Now, in the next moment or in the future, if you don't want to continue to experience that same suffering, or if you don't want to have future sufferings, then you can purify what negative karma you have created in the past to experience future suffering by doing purification. And you may not know exactly specifically what it was, the cause that you created that has you experiencing the suffering or possibly experiencing the suffering in the future. But you can simply say, I purify whatever I did that would cause me to experience this suffering. I purify that. I regret that. Yeah, all those four opponent powers of purification.
All right, you want to do one more?
Yes.
Okay, then we'll move on to Roshni. You can now ask your question.
Hi, good morning, Venerable Drolma.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You had shown this slide about the different realms, and I don't have a problem with believing in reincarnation because I'm a Hindu, and we've always accepted that. But now you said that the Four Noble Truths, of which the last one is that we are aiming from releasing ourselves from suffering. If that is the case, you also mentioned that the demigod and the god realms have very little suffering. Wouldn't then the god realm be more what we should be aiming at, the best realm to be in?
Right. So even though they have very little suffering, they are still subject to the samsaric conditions at the end of their lives of aging and death. And they are also subject to this being born then in one of the lower realms after they've all the seeds that they have planted to experience all those good things. After they wear out, then they're subject to the lower realms again. So these are why we would want liberation. Okay. And even if we can't have get free from that, wanting another human life so that we can continue to practice Dharma, so that we can continue to get to work toward getting free of liberation, is a better realm to want than these other realms, because in those other realms we're so filled with those delusions that we don't even think about practicing Dharma, okay, in those other realms.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yes, sure. Okay, let's do some meditation.
Sure. Before, Venerable, there's
Yes.
just one book suggestion that is a book recommendation on dealing with afflictive emotions or negative thoughts, if you have any.
Well, I'm thinking of the two books on anger that I talked about before. I think it's Healing Anger, one by Thupten Chödrön and one by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Another really good one is Emotional Alchemy.
All right.
And that's by Alchemy. And you can forward this by Tara Bennett. That one, Emotional Alchemy by Tara Bennett Goldman. And yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go into meditation. Let's set up our posture once again. So everyone can make sure that your body is rounded and stable, that you're sitting loosely straight. And simply allowing the bell to bring you to the space of the body for a moment. Taking a couple of minutes to settle down, to go back to the natural state of the body, to also synchronize the mind in this state of calmness and relaxation. letting go of all tension and tightness, letting go of all worries and concerns. And once your body and your mind have settled down, become a little bit more relaxed and stable, you can let go of observing the body, bring the attention to the mind. And so we begin this meditation by contemplating that the nature of your mind is clear and pure, that it has the potential to become enlightened, which is a state of complete purity, goodness, and perfection. You can think, for example, that the nature of every being's mind is clear, vast, and unlimited, like space. Our negative thoughts and emotions are not permanent, they're not fixed parts of the mind, but rather transient, like clouds that pass through the sky. And because they are based on ignorance and misconceptions, they can be cleared away from the mind, which can be developed to a state that is completely pure and positive. And alternatively, if you find it difficult to accept that you can become enlightened, you can think of the positive qualities that you have. Qualities such as intelligence, loving kindness, compassion, generosity, courage. And remind yourself that these qualities can be developed even further and that you can use your life to bring benefit and happiness to others. Feeling joyful about the potential that lies within you. And although all beings have the potential to transform their mind, not all beings are in the most ideal situation in which they can recognize and develop this potential. Human beings are generally in the best situation Non-human beings either have too much suffering or are incapable of developing their potential due to ignorance and other delusions. So take a moment to imagine what it would be, for example, to be like an animal. Animals in the wild have no one to care for them when they experience hunger, thirst, heat, cold, sickness, injuries. They are almost in constant fear of their lives. Domestic animals are sometimes better off, but they lack the freedom and they're often killed for meat, fur, or other products. And all animals, even the most intelligent, have very limited mental capacities. They are unable to develop themselves intellectually or spiritually. So contemplate on this to get a sense of how fortunate you are to have a human life. However, not all human beings have the right conditions to recognize and develop their potential. Imagine, for example, being a destitute beggar or a person living in a war zone. Most of your time and energy would be spent simply in trying to keep yourself and your family alive. You would have little or no time at all to think of anything else. Or imagine, even as a human suffering from a severe mental disability or illness, which would make it very difficult for you to understand the teachings of the mind's potential and how to develop it. Or imagine having a physical condition that causes you a great deal of pain, discomfort, and inconvenience, which hinders your ability to learn and practice any spiritual teachings. Some people don't have access to spiritual teachings that explain the mind's potential and how to develop it. Imagine spending your life in a village that is remote, where no one has ever heard about enlightenment or how to develop the mind. Living there all your life without even hearing a word about spirituality, about developing your own potential. And even if there's some people who are aware of their potential and they have the sincere wish to practice, they are prevented from doing so by others. For example, there are some countries that don't have freedom of religion. And sometimes there are people who face strong objections from their families, their parents, spouse. Imagine how hard it would be to even do some meditation or develop yourself if you were in such a situation. Generate a sense of appreciation for the freedom that you have. And then there are many people who are physically and mentally healthy, people who are materially well off. They have freedom and opportunity to learn spiritual teachings, but they're simply not interested. Their interest lies elsewhere, perhaps in accumulating wealth, property, and possessions, in acquiring worldly knowledge or skills, or simply in experiencing as much pain as they can, as pleasure, sorry. And so they never consider anything which is related to developing themselves. They never consider that all this accumulation of wealth will be left behind when they die. Imagine being in such a situation. And then there's people who engage in harmful actions such as killing, stealing, being abusive or dishonest, not realizing that these actions will cause them suffering and it definitely harm others as well, which creates further obstacles for them to discover their true potential. Recognize how fortunate you are to be interested in developing yourself and using your life in a meaningful, beneficial way for yourself and for others. So seeing how you're free of all these disadvantages, now you can bring your mind to the positive qualities and advantages that you have. You're a human being with an intelligent mind, a loving heart, and a body that you can put to good use. There are people who care about you and support you, family, friends, teachers. You have opportunities to pursue your creative, intellectual, social, and spiritual interests. You enjoy a good standard of life. At least you have enough to survive and stay alive. And most importantly, you have the potential and the opportunity, because of all the other benefits, to investigate, understand, and transform your mind. Even if your life doesn't have as much freedom and comfort as you would like, and even if you live with some difficult problems and challenges, no matter where you are and what conditions you live in, you can always work on your mind. So think how few people or creatures on this earth share these freedoms and chances. And considering this deeply, you will realize how rare and precious a life like yours really is. So take a moment and appreciate your good fortune. Having generated this sense of appreciation, you can also generate an intention, a resolve to use your life wisely, doing your best to avoid harming others and instead helping them as much as you can, developing all the qualities of the heart, love, compassion, and wisdom that enable you to actualize your highest potential. Gently coming out of the meditation, being aware of your surroundings, come back to your body. And now we go into the dedication. May all beings everywhere, plagued by the sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored and find repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be free from their ailments. Whatever diseases are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain, to dispel the miseries of the world.
Okay, thank you very much for staying, and come back tomorrow, and we'll definitely get to Precious Human Rebirth again after this amazing meditation, so you'll have a day to think about how precious your life is. See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.